2 weeks before a pivotal EU summit, Ursula von der Leyen unveiled plans to raise tens of billions of euros for Ukraine's war effort. The options? Borrow on international markets or issue a loan backed by frozen Russian assets, both facing fierce resistance from member states. In a double whammy, Donald Trump's new national security strategy signals a major shakeup to America's role in European security and relations with Russia. Now joining me to discuss is Tom Keatinge, Director of the Center for Finance and Security at the Royal United Services Institute. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on World News Tonight.
Good evening.
Now, let's start with the national security strategy. In it, we read that the first priority for the United States and Europe is reestablishing conditions of stability within Europe and strategic stability with Russia. We often hear that the United States wants to reestablish good economic ties with Russia. How much is that relationship worth, and is it worth sacrificing the relationship with Europe?
Well, the first thing I should say is we should not be surprised by this national security strategy from the United States. Since February, when J.D. Vance spoke at the Munich Security Conference, we've known precisely what the U.S. administration thinks. And so really all we see here is in black and white on paper an articulation of that. And fundamentally, Donald Trump has a problem with the European Union. He doesn't have a problem with European countries per se. He has a problem with the European Union because it presents a united bloc. And that is something which he has a problem with. And so he is obviously arguing that political parties, opposition parties in Europe that oppose the European Union should be supported to bring back stability, greatness, I think the document calls it, to Europe.
Well, isn't it a paradox that Europe is doing everything that the U.S. or Donald Trump has been asking? It's increasing its defense expenditure to 5% of GDP. Meanwhile, Donald Trump supports far-right parties in Europe who would never spend so much on defense, especially to counter Russia.
Well, if you think that Donald Trump is logical in the way he operates and in what he says, then, I mean, that's a fundamental fallacy that we should have got over many months ago. I mean, the bottom line is that if you look at the kind of the economic elements of this national security strategy, you will see that Donald Trump wants any barrier to the United States access to markets being cleared away. Just look at the fuss in the last 48 hours over the fine that the European Commission has levied on X for breaching European law on transparency. You would have thought from the fuss that senior people such as Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and others are making, you would have thought that the European Union had shut down Twitter, had stopped it from operating, which is the case, by the way, in Russia. But no, all it's done is said, this is the law in Europe, you haven't followed it, you are therefore fined. So the contradictions come thick and fast, but the bottom line is that none of this is a surprise. And it's time, frankly, that the European Union and the leaders in Brussels and across member states woke up to the reality of Donald Trump and stopped wishing that he were different.
Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk tweeted that, or he posted on X, that Europe is your closest ally, not your problem. Is there a way for Europe to reliably count on the United States now, or is it essentially an end to NATO as we know it? What about the Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, for instance?
Yeah, so let's remember, I mean, Donald Trump will be president for another 3 years. So what the European Union should be doing, in my view, and I think people like Donald Tusk are right to send the kind of positive, friendly messages that he's sending. But I think also people like Donald Tusk are right to say, look, Europe, you've got to wake up. Don't sit there and assume that the United States is the same kind of ally as it has been for the last 80 years. It might change. It might change back that way in 3-4 years' time with a new president. But right now, the threat is from Russia. The threat is also from being undermined by the United States. And as I say, don't wish that things change for the better. Build up your defense capability, stand on your own 2 feet, and assume that the United States is not going to be the reliable ally that it's always been.
Should the European Union, should European NATO members be in a state of emergency right now to build up these capabilities? And I mean, Washington is, pushing for Europe to take on its own defense responsibilities by 2027.
Well, I mean, as a citizen of a European country, I would want my country to take its defense seriously. So, of course, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the only time that Article 5 of NATO, the mutual defense element of the NATO treaty, has ever been invoked was by the United States in the context of the 9/11 attacks. So, Europe has supported America in its hour of need. I'm sure the Americans would support Europe in its hour of need, but the bottom line is we cannot rely on that. And so, we're quite right to move fast, to strengthen our defenses, to strengthen our defense spending, and assume that if the worst happens, the United States might be leading from behind, as they say.
Well, there's been also talk of the EU. Well, the EU collectively holds over $2.3 billion in U.S. bonds, and there's been an idea of selling those bonds if the United States throws Ukraine or Europe under the bus in these negotiations. What do you think the likelihood of that actually happening is, and what would that do to the transatlantic relationship?
I don't know whose idea that is, but they obviously don't understand anything about the capital markets or the bond markets. It would frankly be a petty thing to do. What the EU should do is move forward on what it has within its capability. So yes, defense spending, but also, I mean, a really good example here is the fact that we are still talking many years after Russia's central bank assets were immobilized, mainly at Euroclear, the bank in Belgium. We're still talking about what to do with those assets. And there's a very real possibility, as we saw in the 28-point peace plan that the Americans proposed recently jointly with Russia. There's a very real possibility that Donald Trump will do some deal with the Russians that mean those assets get taken away from European control, or at least we get put in a position where the Europeans have to agree with the assets to move away from European control. So that's a really good example of how dithering and delaying means that Europe will find itself dancing to the tune of Donald Trump rather than setting its own agenda and being responsible for its own destiny. I mean, Europe is an enormous economy, a huge population, a global trading powerhouse, yet it finds itself subservient to the United States.
The EU is looking for at least 90 billion euros to keep Kyiv afloat for the next 2 years, allowing it to negotiate from a position of strength with Russia. Friday's meeting between the European Commission President and the German Chancellor and the Belgian Prime Minister brought no breakthrough. What needs to be done to assure Belgium that it won't be on the hook if it releases the frozen Russian assets?
Well, there was a great headline in Politico on Friday saying that Bart de Wever was a useful Russian asset. And I think, frankly, that is the case. I mean, it's downright disgraceful that Belgium continues to block supporting the Ukrainians with those assets. Obviously, Belgium has some legitimate concerns. I think the European Union member states are trying their best to deal with those concerns. But fundamentally, each European state has to play its part in supporting Ukraine. Poland plays its part by having taken in huge numbers of refugees, being a huge military staging post. That's a significant drain on the Polish economy, I'm quite sure. So it's time Belgium stood up and recognized that the right thing to do is to unlock those assets for the benefit of Ukraine, to accept the sorts of guarantees and support that other EU member states are willing to offer, and recognize that the chances of the kind of legal case that Bart de Wever is talking about is so unlikely that, frankly, the probability is very low, and therefore the risk that he worries about is almost certainly not going to come to pass.
Okay, so what happens if the EU can't overcome this obstacle?
If the EU can't overcome the obstacle, then it proves Donald Trump right. It proves Donald Trump that it is unable to operate for the good of its citizens. It's unable to bring forward European greatness, as the US national security strategy has to say. And at the end of the day, European Union taxpayers will foot or continue to foot the bill for supporting Ukraine. There is free money lying on the table in Brussels at Euroclear. And if that money isn't used, I don't think the European Union is going to say, well, sorry, Ukraine, we won't support you. It will simply have to call on its own funds, which means that citizens across the European Union will find that they are paying for the support of Ukraine, continuing to pay for the support of Ukraine. So, it's a double whammy. Those assets should be used. It would show that Europe is strong and united, demonstrate to Donald Trump and to the Kremlin that Europe is united, and provide Ukraine with the absolutely critical funding it needs for its defense and the continued functioning of its economy.
Would that look like somewhat of a coalition of the willing in terms of finance for Ukraine? And when would Ukraine run out of money?
Well, I think Ukraine will run out of money extremely soon, in just a few months. I mean, this is critical. There are financial facilities, the Ukraine facility of the European Union, for example, that continue to support Ukraine. But ultimately, to have a whole load of money lying in an enormous pile in Belgium and not use it is frankly criminal. And if I were a European Union taxpayer, I'd be extremely cross with the Belgians for essentially inflicting the costs of the war in Ukraine on the European citizens, rather than inflicting the cost of the war in Ukraine on Russia, which is the aggressor and the perpetrator of this tragic conflict.
Yes, Tom Keatinge, Director at the Center of Finance and Security at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you so much for joining us on World News Tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful evening and hope to see you next time. Goodbye.